My involvement in social justice movement started before 1968, and I was a young teenager and had come to Chicago and participated in the Martin Luther King demonstrations that were here in 1965, and went back home and decided that I didn't want to be in that little small town anymore, and so my sister and I came to Chicago in 1965. We were involved in the NAACP and the youth movement in Michigan, but it wasn't Chicago. Chicago was an electric place in the 60s, and it was a place to come and be engaged in bigger social issues. And so we came back and have been here since '65. My mother was very active, and she was always behind the scenes. She was a secretary, and she was sort of the person who worked in the office, but she was always very much involved. And I come from a biracial family, and I think my parents were married at a time when it wasn't socially acceptable for black and white people to relate to each other and certainly to be married. And so I think she had a very particular calling to be involved politically and socially. And so she came to Chicago, and actually she was brought to Chicago by the aunt and uncle of Emmett Till. And this was in the early 50s. And my parents were divorced very early, and she came to Chicago, and we followed her in the 60s. And so we lived in Michigan with my dad. But because she was here and because she was sort of involved in, at that time, civil rights work, she took us to rallies and exposed us to sort of the issues of the day. And I think that as young people, we were very impressionable and very interested in. And I was a student, a high school student. So issues around school and the protesting that happened with Willis wagons and the superintendent of schools at that time obviously resonated with me as a young student of Chicago Public Schools. So I think that we were sort of mesmerized and influenced by both personal family involvement as well as kind of what was happening on the West Side. And there was a lot of political action happening on the West Side of Chicago. And we were just in the middle of it. I don't remember having a sense of the danger. We were naive too. So I do remember that after I became a member of the Black Panther Party, I had several friends who were killed, and some killed by the police, and just some killed by their own involvement. And so, that eventually impacted the direction that I took, certainly after Fred Hampton was killed. But while we were involved in it, we just were, we felt like we were on the right side of history, and we felt like, we were going to make the difference. There was a small group of us at Malcolm X College. At the time, it was Crane Junior College. There was a small group of us, and we just felt like we were going to change the world. And so we didn't have a sense of danger. I have a friend who is now a big shot doctor in Chicago, who was a young 16-year-old who left home, and we had to shelter her for several months, and her mother had the FBI out looking for her. We had no idea of the power of the FBI. We just didn't. We just felt like we were doing the right thing. So a sense of danger, there wasn't, at least immediately. At some point, I think after Fred Hampton was killed, there was a tremendous sense of, our own vulnerability. I was a student at Crane College, and I don't think a lot of people sort of really understand sort of the importance of junior colleges at that time. Crane College was over here on the west side of Chicago. It was housed inside Crane High School. And because I'm not sure where it was before, but because it was housed inside the high school, we had a very little small part of the college. We had like a room and maybe some classrooms that we used. So that meant that there were a good number of us who were, we related very closely to each other because we didn't have a lot of space. And in the 60s and the middle 60s and after, there was a lot of youth organizing, student organizing happening, and that was the site of where a lot of Chicago youth were being organized at Crane Junior College. I just happened to be at the right place at the right time. I was aware of social issues because as a high school student I was aware, but I wasn't really very active other than sort of my early time in Michigan and then sort of participating in rallies when I came to Chicago. But when I was there, I was very actively recruited. And I was actively looking for an opportunity to be involved in something. And so I remember showing up at a rally, and I remember being invited to come to the office and join if I wanted to be a part of a movement. And the very next day, I showed up. And it happened just as simple as that. And I'll tell a very funny story. I'm light-skinned, biracial. And I remember the person who was speaking at the rally, who was really trying to hype up the crowd, said, we want to make sure that, people can come and join us. And, this is the Black Panther Party, so that we want Black people to come. And if you're too light-skinned, you're welcome to join. Just bring your birth certificate. And I showed up the next day with my birth certificate. And I think, he was a little bit surprised, who was this kid showing up with this birth certificate? But I was very serious, and that was how I got involved. I left, I would say probably within 3 to 6 months after Fred Hampton was assassinated. I'm not actually sure sort of what was the transition from the Black Panther Party to the women's movement. I think probably some of that had to do with people that I met and opportunities to sort of participate in very specific events. But so I didn't consciously leave the party because of any sort of actions on the part of the Panthers around women. I was aware and sensitive to sexism in the organization. And there was sexism in the organization. I mean, we did all the grunt work. We did all the work. And there were very few women in leadership, but that wasn't necessarily a part of our consciousness at the time. I think it was like when you step away and you look back, you can kind of see things that perhaps you hadn't seen when you were part of the organization. So sort of it didn't drive me to the women's movement, but I think that there were opportunities to be involved in women's conversations and women's issues, and I took a part of that. Let me just say that now that I think about it, this is probably the very first time I'm saying this, and I'm saying it on camera. I had an abortion in the late 60s. I had my first child in 1968. And I believe that experience is what got me involved in the women's movement, because it was the organization Jane, which sort of started here in Illinois, the abortion rights movement, that women who were trained to give abortions to other women. It was an underground movement, and I think that was the connection that I made to the women's movement. I had to have an abortion, and I became associated with the organization Jane. After I got involved with the women's movement, I had the opportunity to go to Puerto Rico, and I went to Puerto Rico with the Puerto Rican Socialist Party. Again, a young woman, happened to be at the right place at the right time, and they said, "Oh, you want to go to Puerto Rico?" And I'm like, "Yeah," and they said, "It's a free ride." So I went and got involved with the anti-sterilization work that was happening in Puerto Rico, and so my interest was in sort of reproductive rights, but from a sort of a different perspective. And I would say for several years after that, I came back here and finished my graduate degree at Jane Addams, and was very much involved in abortion rights issues and reproductive rights and women's issues. Sort of that led me to somehow over the years get involved more in electoral politics, and was involved with the Harold Washington election, was involved in the anti-violence movement after sort of the middle 80s and beyond. I was also very involved with the anti-apartheid movement. And again, it was sort of making all of these sort of connections, and making connections with people who were involved in all different phases. Sometimes it sounds like, oh, you're involved in this, you're involved in this, you're involved in this. But really, it was sort of like everybody was in some ways involved in everything at different times in their own history. And a particular issue was important at a particular time. And so I just had, the wonderful opportunity, I think, to learn a lot about social movements here in the city, in the United States, and around the world, because a lot of it was bubbling up here in Chicago. It just sort of moves you, and you hope that you progress in sort of your awareness and your skills and your connections, and that you start to see a bigger picture. That you start out maybe with a small sort of notion of things that are happening in your context, and hopefully you grow, and that these are opportunities to sort of grow in your understanding of sort of social conditions and political realities, and you start to sort of develop a consciousness that's much sort of broader than sort of maybe that one little thing that you were involved in. Sometimes I think that we sometimes lose sight of the importance of the bigger sort of battles, and we fight with each other around sort of our own little sectarian sort of differences, while sort of capital is organizing and money is organizing, and not in plain view in some ways. I mean, it may be in plain view, but sort of you look at sort of the way in which the right has organized, it's sometimes people are like, it just came out of nowhere. No. They've been putting money in universities. I mean, they've sort of been working, and we've been fighting in public with each other. I think it's time for us to realize that we have to sort of organize ourselves in different ways, that we have to kind of not be so quick to expect perfection in our movements, that we have to open ourselves up and broaden our ways in which we relate to each other politically. I just had an interesting experience this past summer. I've been doing a lot of genealogy, family genealogy, and been doing a lot of with my whole family, but with the white side of my family, which I never did that before because they were like the white people in my family. And I've come to realize that I have all these Southern white relatives who are staunch Democrats. And so my mind is thinking, Democrats, Alabama, white? Where the hell did these people come from? And realizing that we have allies in places that we don't expect to have allies. And we need to start finding those allies and not making the assumptions that all white people in Alabama are right-wing racist pigs, that there are some places where we have friends and allies and political colleagues where we don't always think that we do. So how do we open ourselves up to not making ourselves smaller, but figuring out how to make ourselves bigger? I just feel like this particular moment is an opportunity to think differently about how we connect with each other. I look at some of the friends that I have, who I have been friends with since the 60s or the 70s. And I have to stop and think, wow, these people have been people that I have been relating to over the long haul. White people, Latino people, people who are maybe different from me. And to acknowledge that and respect that and take advantage of that. And I do agree that, you know, unfortunately, maybe throughout the years we've had political alliances, and we haven't always had sort of those personal alliances. But sometimes we have, but we haven't sort of thought of them maybe in political ways. I don't know. I mean, I still think we live in such a very segregated city. And it's still very frustrating that, you know, our kids, my grandkids go to segregated schools because they live in Humboldt Park. And so we haven't sort of figured out, when I turned 50, and I'm past 50, okay, but when I turned 50, I said, I want to have a birthday party. I want to have a 50th birthday party. And we stopped and we thought, where can we have a birthday party where my South Side friends will come to and my North Side friends will come to? Nobody will go to the West Side. So how do we get the West Side folks there? How do we build this way in which we can relate to each other, communities and lives in a different kind of way? And, you know, it was a sobering moment to realize that we just don't cross each other's boundaries very well. And how do we make that happen? You know, and I think sometimes we romanticize the 60s a bit too much and don't always sort of think about the things that sort of splintered us or fractured our work. I mean, when you stop and think about it, you know, what happened in the 60s, certainly with the Black Panther Party, and it was a very short period of time, you know, and then all of a sudden, many things were gone. You know, some things might have went underground, people went off in there, but it was a movement that was destroyed in lots of ways by its success. And so, you know, people will stop and think, well, wait a minute, is this a continuation of that, or did things end and then new things began? And so those are questions that I think are important to sort of think about. What is it that we experienced that sort of destroyed that particular moment? And because it was a very short period of time. 3 or 4 years is not a long time in the grand scheme of things. I've been on this earth 67 years. And I'm like, oh my God, that was only a little bit of time.